Well, good afternoon to everybody. Welcoming everybody to this evening's seminar. We're very ever so happy to have as a guest Mario Diani, professor of sociology at the University of Trento, who is a very close friend, a long-time associate of the laboratory for over a decade now, and one amongst the key theoreticians in the field. As you all know, Mario has worked extensively on social movements as a particular form of network organizing. Indeed, he has pioneered this perspective with work such as Green Networks of 1995, The Cement of Civil Society of 2015, and his more recent collaborative multimodal political networks, which came out in 2021. Of course, this is not to forget, and one should not fail to mention, his very influential social movements and networks, which he co-edited in 2003 with another important friend of the laboratory, Doug McAdam, and of his work with yet another important collaborator of ours, Donatella Della Porta, and I'm referring to his co-authorship of Social Movements and Introduction. Indeed, we have made a presentation of the 2020 edition at Pantheon in December 2019. I think before the second edition, it even come out before the COVID lockdowns. And of course, the joint edition of the Oxford Handbook of Social Movements. It is thus always a very big pleasure and a great honor, I'd even add, even though I know Mario's response that these are just good welcoming words. Well, they are not. I mean every single one of them, and I want to thank him for his support and for his friendship all these years. I have already tried to communicate to him the particulars of this year's hybrid seminar, held both with physical presence and online. Not an easy endeavor, but all the same, I think, worth the effort. And as always, we begin with a brief introduction on my part, which I will try to keep short as I'm also commenting on the paper he will be presenting. Well, in this context, let me begin by saying that an aspect which has always impressed me with Mario's work is something that I make a great deal of, and I mean positive heuristics, the main element of all progressive research programs in Lakatos's sense. And let me briefly explain why I think along those lines. You know, of course, that Mario insists that the defining property of social movements is their quality as networks. That is, you cannot have a social movement unless you have a network, or to put it otherwise, that social movements are a variety of networks. In my mind, and perhaps ironically for that, the epistemologically progressive dimension in this perspective stems from the fact that my, and perhaps the laboratories as a whole, overall focus is slightly different. And you know that in recent years, I've been trying to stress the key role of policy content, even more so than formal framing, by arguing that the key, or at least one of the key defining properties of social movements, is the drive towards substantive democratization. Well, Mario keeps problematizing and extending our thinking in pointing to hitherto unexplored areas, precisely by raising questions emerging from this network's perspective. Of course, we will have a chance to appreciate one of these this evening when he will be discussing the prerequisites of musical productivity, or I would like to think of it as musical creativity. It is an utterly new and unfamiliar topic, and this by itself, of course, is wonderful. A topic obviously breaking new grounds, and perhaps more importantly, forcing us to think and ponder over this notion of, what's I call it, inventiveness, resourcefulness, capacity to think out of the box. And this is clearly really exciting stuff. In the advertisement to this evening's seminar, I stress that one key contribution of contentious politics as a field has been its relational epistemology, along with its insistence that contentious collective action simply cannot be read off structural, static, given structural parameters. Now, among other things, this means that an important role must be assigned not only to subjective interpretations of reality, the famous attributions of opportunity and threat, for instance, but also to contingency. That is precisely to factors such as creativity and inventiveness, which cannot be read off any given conditions. I mean, what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. Pending, of course, the presentation, my sense is that Mario's concerns point precisely to that direction. In other words, is there a way to think analogically on this subject? I mean, draw analogies between musical production as a collective process and movement creativity. Can we draw meaningful conclusions, even if such conclusions may be approximate and tentative? And are there distinct conditions that favor movement resourcefulness and the obverse, factors that inhibit it? But I think there is more. I just used the term contingency, and by contingency, we usually refer to events or behaviors that cannot be inferred, as I implied earlier, or read off from things we already know, things that may be structural or otherwise. But think of it. I mean, when we experience something, we cannot see it causally arising from a condition that is already known. We call it contingent. Say the role of personality or leadership in politics. But is it really ontologically contingent? Or do we simply think of it along those lines because we have yet to determine the factors and the mechanisms that bring it about? Well, I think that Mario's recent work, the work he will be presenting, both raises these questions and provides us with research tools for answering some of them. So I want to thank him once again. I welcome him one more time to the seminar, and I'm passing on the floor to him.
Thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's not rhetorical, especially after COVID and all the troubles that this has created. Thank you. I think you need to switch it off. There is a double.
Yeah,
Close your microphone.
yes, I can. Now everything is. We have to be patient a little.
Εγώ δεν ακούω.
Μάκη, δεν ακούμε.
Ναι, ούτε εγώ ακούω.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Good. And can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, so everything is working. Smashing.
Start from the beginning.
Yeah, I will start from the beginning because clearly the focus of the topic today is on the first part of the title, music production as collective process, and hopefully come the end, we'll be able to share some ideas, insights along the lines that Marcus brilliantly highlighted right now. What this kind of lesson can we take from the analysis of mechanisms which are clearly different at one level, but which can also tell us more about more general dynamics or linked to collective action and, as Marcus suggested, creativity. Now, a few words. This talk originates from a project to which I am contributing, a project on music schools in the region of Trentino, where the University of Trento is based. And the project is led by my colleague Silvia Sacchetti, who is an economist with a particular interest in cultural and in organizational processes. And this talk is part draws upon a larger paper that we have wrote together, and we hope to see in print sometime. I will clarify in a second why the case of school teaching and is interesting and is relevant in the context of this question. Provides a relevant illustration of these questions, or the questions that I'm going to address. Generally speaking, the starting point is certainly not new. The idea that music and artistic production in general is not just, or at least is not merely, is not exclusively an act of personal geniality, or personal expression of personal feelings, personal values, personal skills as well. This idea is certainly not new, has been picked up many times. Just to stick to recent times, or on relatively recent times, there have been important work by Howard Becker, for example, in his 1983 book Art Worlds, as well as by others that we perhaps will meet through the talk. The idea fundamentally is precisely the artistic production and music is actually a strongly interactive process. It's an interactive process which obviously involves a huge variety of fellow musicians in the first place, any kind, but well beyond that. I mean, obviously, the quality of production is certainly affected by interaction with the public. Make it easier or make more difficult the production of music and the transmission of music, and all these elements, all these different types of there are, of course, depending on the extent, depending on the visibility of the activity, there are certainly media operators at different levels who play a role in shaping what contribute to shape what is ultimately an artistic product. So it's important to recognize this multiplicity, and I like to mention alongside the work of Baker important studies that have explored these dynamics, not at the level, let's say, of the professional artists, the serious, so to speak, the serious musicians, but also at the level which is much more widespread of amateur or semi-amateur musicians. One example is the study by Ruth Finnegan, published at the end of the 1990s, which is a wonderful chart mapping of very different forms of musical production in the English town of Milton Keynes. More recently, and particularly relevant to my own perspective, as being the work by Nick Crossley of Manchester University, particularly relevant from my point of view because Nick has devoted an attention to music by drawing very heavily and using very heavily the concepts and the tools of network analysis. Actually used in the analysis of network, in the analysis of musical production, a theoretical combination of the concept of field and in the version inspired by Pierre Bourdieu, with the tools of network analysis, which is in many ways an unusual, non-frequent combination. So an example of creativity in its own right. And on this, Crossley has this book on 2020 on the general social aspect of making music, but he also in 2015 important study of the network, of the emergence of the network, of the punk phenomena in the UK from a network perspective. So the idea is certainly the basic idea behind my talk is certainly not new. The focus of the paper is much more limited, is much smaller, and it's simply an attempt to see to what extent the artistic production, in particular record production, is affected of musicians is affected by the particular nature of the networks, of the interpersonal networks in which these people are embedded. So it's not just a matter of saying that or showing what I'm going to show. It's not just that network connections matter for artistic production, but it's also an attempt to explore to some degree of what kind of network, what kind of network configuration, what kind of relational pattern is seems to be particularly conducive to musical production. The case study is limited, but it is quite interesting and revealing. The data come from actually 253 professional music teachers acting within 12 music schools in the region of Trentino. The case is particular and peculiar because Trentino is quite unusual in the funding, in the support that public authorities give to music training, which is very unusual and is very generous. And there are actually now, as of now, 13, but for one, the data are missing altogether. It is 13 music schools which are part of a formal, called the Trentino Music School System, formal system of formal agreement with the local government, the provincial government, whereby the provincial government contributes significantly to the activity of the schools, as long as they subscribe to a broadly defined curricula, more or less, which satisfies certain minimal requirements. This has facilitated, certainly hugely facilitated the extension of basic musical training, in particular to kids. The contribution is particularly generous for kids, very young kids, and gradually decreases as long as we approach, say, a more adult set of type of students. We're really talking the contribution here. We're talking about contribution in the region between 5-6 million euros per year, spread, and which enable several thousands, 5, 6, 7,000 pupils every year to take lessons, which in a region of, like Trentino, which has little more than 500,000 residents, is a very remarkable. Now, how this system come about? The system come about mostly through a process which, in many ways, can resemble sort of a kind of movement dynamic, because in the sense that it started off as a network of informal musicians, particularly with particular growth of interest between the 70s and the 80s, and gradually brought this type of spontaneous collaborations eventually got recognized by the system, and through a combination of, say, of planning and occasional contingent developments, we reach the system of the day. The system of the day is, at the same time, and that's where the issue of motivation and steps into play. One aspect of the question is, of course, that these are not professional musicians whose living depends primarily on artistic production. These are teachers, primarily. And as we know, as we shall see later, just in a second, it's clearly artistic production is not the preserve of the totality of these people. It's actually fairly limited. At the same time, there are reasons to argue that even the quality of teaching is a bit like actually in university. If you don't do research and you only teach, the quality it can be argued that the quality of teaching is less dynamic, less engaging, etc. Anyway, that's the issue really. That's the contents in which the question: what kind of relational embeddedness facilitate these guys to produce arise? That's the source of the question. In the paper, as we shall see, I will address two basic lines of research. One is very big and one is just developing. The very big one is the work that in sociology, as well as in particular economic sociology, as well in organizational theory, is being conducted most prominently by people like Mark Granovetter or Ronald Burt, about precisely the embeddedness of social action in general, which of course music action is really one part. The other is a line of research even more interdisciplinary in many ways, focused on the search for the mechanism that may secure, that may contribute to the vitality, the dynamism of individuals and or specific collectivities. And this is a line which is pursued by my co-author Silvia Sacchetti, who defines, in particular, in a recent work, vitality as the ability of an actor or a collectivity of actors to put in place actions that reflect their creativeness and are consistent with self and other actualizing outcomes. Such actions reflect positive self and other regarding value. What this brings to the fundamentally. Why is it showing there? I've got a question for the people who are following online. Are you following the passage from one slide to the other? Are you seeing it?
I'm
No.
only seeing the first slide.
Oh my God.
Me also, yes.
And I wondered why.
I know the slightest idea. I mean.
Mario, the same was happening yesterday.
And how did it sort it out?
It was sorted out.
Now it's moving.
Yes.
It's
Now you
moving.
It is moving.
Yes. Well, now it's on slide 6.
So I go back because
Uh,
so I'm sorry, guys.
Yeah, it's moving now, so it's on 3.
Okay.
I thought you were going to do something super duper spectacular.
Well, I don't know, frankly, what is happening because something disappeared in between. And anyway, so that's okay. Now, let me give you some. Those are the main references, the fundamental. Now you can see, you should be seeing a list of schools. Okay, correct? A table. Are you seeing a table?
Yes, table 1.
Okay, fantastic. Back we are. Now, what is the... Okay, exactly, fine. Now, this is the basic information about the population. As you see, most of the schools were established between the early 1980s and the early 1990s. There is one exception, 1975. I'm circling it, and one historical exception is a civic school, which goes back even to 1889. But that's a very minor exception. Altogether, we're talking about 253 people, of which, however, only, as you can see at the bottom, only 126 of these are actually active. Mean active, we mean in a very inclusive way. We just mean by having at least one production to their credit, which can be found in some of the available repertoires of record production, which are including Google Music or anyway. So we were pretty inclusive at that level. Still, this is so there is first of all about 50% of the teachers who do not have any visible perceived production. This doesn't rule out, of course, the possibility they might have had in a very distant past some recording, but anyway, that's the situation that you can at least refer back to at least the last 20 years or so. Then, if you look at the other column, there is a huge differential between the average production per teacher. Some schools, for example, the first one, CDM, in the average, teachers have almost 5 productions. Other schools are pretty low, even in the average less than 1 production. This is important because it suggests that there are it points at the fact that we will pick later that actually even when we look at the contest, we don't just look at the impact of the network, the ego network in which the specific musician is involved, but we also need to take into account the average situation of the average distribution of organizational traits, features, properties. Some there are, as you can see from the last column, 25% of the overall productions recorded are concentrated in one school. And if you look at the top 4 schools, the schools in double figures, they account basically for 2/3 of the entire music production. So there is huge also difference not only in the style of individuals, but also in the overall pattern of behavior that you can find in different schools. Now, these were the things that I already spoke to, and based on the strands of literature that I mentioned, we came up with 5 basic hypotheses. The first one was the expectation that music productivity will be correlated to the overall volume of collaborative ties in which music teachers are involved. What are collaborative ties? Collaborative ties are information about number of collaborators that these people mention on their website. Each of them had a web page, and we see how many collaborators they refer to. It's clear that there may be some mismatch depending on the style of different people in using the internet, but nevertheless, that was the systematic possible source of data that we could secure. At one level, this is a trivial argument. I mean, of course, if you have more collaboration, you are sooner or later you are going to end up with more more records to your credit. However, we need to keep in mind that when we talk about this type of collaboration, we are really talking about collaboration that can go well beyond the activity of making records. I mean, people can collaborate in gigs, can collaborate in setting up the soundtrack for theater or movies. They can conduct jointly specific program of training, for example, running master classes or whatever. They can conduct choirs, bands, music, and some. There are all sorts of activities, and some of them, and the research, for example, that I mentioned, Ruth Finnegan, showed that some of these activity may also be positive, discouraging the record production. For example, some musicians clearly work on especially semi-amateur, I mean semi-professional, semi-amateur musicians, which are relatively close to our unit of analysis. I mean, our unit of analysis are professional, but clearly they're professional, as we say, more on the teaching side than not necessarily on the other side. So even in those cases, some focus on gigs, for example, or on theater shows can be detrimental to record production in principle. So that's the logic of the hypothesis. But this clearly this is a very basic element. Then we try to better articulate this hypothesis by looking at other dynamics. The second hypothesis was largely inspired by Granovetter's, not so much in terms of we assess the weak tie, but there is a point in Granovetter's analysis which is very important. Granovetter suggests the weak ties also tend to be less dense, or so if you are that's the important part of the point. What Granovetter suggests that if you get better, it's talking clearly about a very different context, but what he suggests is that you get a better environment, better opportunities, better information, better stimuli, better ideas, or a broader set of ideas if your contacts are dispersed. If you're only talking to same people who all know each other, you're much more likely to end up with the same amount of information that you already had without expanding significantly on it. So in terms of translating this basic intuition in our terms, one might expect that people who are more strongly connected, collaborating with people who are outside the local system. Our term of reference is the local system, teachers of this school system, and the rest of the world. People who are many more ties outside the world might reasonably expected to have more opportunities, to have more incentives to produce, to engage in active music production than those who are not. So, in order to assign a weight to this mechanism dynamics, we use a very simple index in network, which is called the EI index, which has been elaborated by David Crackert of, I think, University of Pittsburgh. And Crackert, the logic of the index is pretty simple. Is external, having defined one characteristic of an actor. In our case, it's local connection or external personal connection to a person, internal or external to the system. Now you divide, you subtract the number of ties to actors of your group from the ties that you have external, E minus I, and you divide by the overall number of connections that you have. So if you are the index ranges between -1 and 1 is 1 if it is score 1 if you only have contacts external to your group. It is -1 if all the contacts are internal to your group. Okay, so there is, in this case, we basically what is supposed is a kind of linear relationship between the level of heterophily, the level of the amount of ties external to one group and productivity. Linked to that, however, we can take another line or another slightly different approach, and consider that yes, external ties are conducive to the extent that they introduce you to new ideas, etc. But at the same time, there is also a value in being strongly connected to one specific environment, to the environment in which one normally operates, to the context in which one normally lives and works. Because in many ways, like in protest community, the daily face-to-face interaction reinforces a sense of identity, a sense of belongingness. It also creates, to some extent, mechanisms of that we can call of, perhaps in a more negative term, of mutual control and competition, or in a more positive, also positive influence and emulation. In any case, these are ties that will ultimately these are effects that ultimately missing if your range of connections is totally dispersed. Unless you are a superstar of the music world, in which you don't bother where you are located, of course, but it is not unreasonable to assume that this type of basic mechanisms of face-to-face interaction may play also a role in driving people ahead. So the question is, of course, the other side of the story is totally local ties can at the same time engender complacency, self-referentiality. They can create what my colleague Silvia Sacchetti has called the situation of locking, in which you're tied into certain practices, you're tied into certain styles, and you're not encouraged to search for new options, to search for new ideas, and also this also may generate, in this particular case, given the fact that the core business of these people is music teaching, not recording, producing, this can also generate and reinforce the tendency to focus precisely on teaching to the detriment of the other activities. So to test this particular hypothesis, this is no longer an hypothesis about linear relationship, it's more an hypothesis about a curvilinear relation, namely suggesting that the productivity might be higher for people who have a balanced set of ties, so who are linked enough to their direct colleagues and local colleagues to get this type of every daily incentive and daily sense of being part of the community, but at the same time are also open to the external environment to get new ideas in. So far, these hypotheses are basically an attempt to specify in different ways the nature of the, you could call the ego network of each musician, namely what is the nature of the connections between the people with whom each musician is connected. We can also try to take a different perspective, however, and see whether the incentive to productivity comes from a particular position occupied in the general structure of the local system. By general structure of the local system, I mean that the collaborative ties or the interpersonal connections anyway, which exist between all the musicians of the local city. And there are, for example, there has been a very important study by Brian Uzzi and this co-author about the producers of musical shows in Broadway, and they were looking at the network connecting these operators, etc. And what this suggested was that the study suggested was that the most productive and successful were people who were occupying sort of an intermediate position they were neither totally peripheral to this network of producers and creators, but were neither nor too central. But instead, yet again, were occupying a position which enabled them to link to the core player, but at the same time also to be open to other type of influences. And in the case of Trento, this is the overall structure that you can see, and it's not very big, but you will notice that the center, a number of white triangles, those are the core people, and the intermediate positions are defined by the red circles. So the question, these are individuals, and these are not only the collaborative ties. So what the hell is no? Okay, I'm fine. We're fine. It's not only the people who are totally, it's quite a high number of people who occupy this intermediate position. We are going to explore whether this intermediate positioning, you see, there are actors who are totally isolated, there are actors who are linked, not necessarily through collaboratively. This may also be linked, interpersonal links due to the past sharing of same training in the same type of school. It is much broader set of connection. But anyway, we are going to see if the intermediate people intermediate might actually be also in the position to see their productivity, creativity stimulated in a way. It's a way of reformulating in terms of the local system what was first articulated, specified in terms of position of single individuals. And then finally, of course, I already mentioned that there is the possibility to consider the possibility that actually the organizational context, the overall ethos or the dominant way of operating in a certain school affects or not productivity. And in this regard, Ronald Barthes came out with the hypothesis that the most effective, effective organizations are the ones that in the system of connection that the members have with other partners, with our potential competitor, etc., with the system, they combine two properties, two features. A good capacity to act in a cohesive, integrated manner within, which means can be translated in this particular case into a sizable number of internal collaborative ties, but also in the ability of this organization to broker it, to create a broker, to activate contacts, mediations, exchanges with other members of the environment. And this because basically this means the ability of these people to fill structural holes and get access to larger sets of the environment. From the point of view of our schools, we have we did a very elementary operationalization. So we look at what is the average amount of ties to the external and internal ties that members of each school are involved in. And this classifies the school by the median. The schools that you see in green are the ones that are above the median in both the average number of connections that their members have to the external system and internal, and also about the average density of collaboration internally. The red ones are the ones which are low on both grounds, and the intermediate ones are the ones that combine at different levels. So the expectation would be, on the one hand, that say schools, individuals who work for schools which in the average have a higher number of ties, external and internal, they will also be more productive. And also that individuals that work in school which are very low in the average level of collaboration, internal and external, will also be less productive at this net of their personal connection. yeah, the logic you may well be, you may have a balanced, a good balance of ties to the other colleagues outside and to colleagues in the system. But if you are in a school in which, in the average, people are very disconnected, you don't feel at the same time the organizational pressure that might come instead from the fact of operating in a very dynamic, very well connected context. So these are the hypotheses. Now the results. The results are fundamental. Given the fact that this is really a split population, you've seen it. Half of them do not produce at all, and the others have some production. We run two different kinds of analysis. A logistic analysis first to try to see if there was any relational pattern that differentiated in a neat way between not those who didn't have any production, those who had at least some production, some sign of production. And then later on we concentrated instead on those who are really producing and see if differences in productivity, or as Serafin suggested, creativity, can be affected by relational patterns. It has to be said that there are clear limits to this analysis, to the extent that we need to be clear about that. Given that the source of information, the source of our information, the websites, we were not really able to introduce many control variables in the analysis. But the main control variable we have main control variables we have is gender, which turns out to be actually no insignificant, but we don't have information about age or about the particular profile of a musician, the overall socioeconomic condition of a certain musician, because for all, I think, given the source of data is pretty obvious. Now, let's look first at what are the determinants. And here are the determinants of having at least one collaboration to credit. This brings we run different models, and the first four models are the first four columns correspond to the models that we have laid out. They are just introduced. The fifth one we can ignore it, but just it's simply the same kind of analysis produced in model 4, but with the exclusion of one school, the CDM school, because it was disproportionately productive. So to see if that might represent an outlier that distorted the overall results. So the pattern is pretty consistent, as you can see for the first three levels. Only two variables are consistently significant. One is the overall volume of collaboration. If you do something, wherever it is located, wherever it is, whatever its nature, that's is a reasonable, significant predictor that somehow you are productive. You are more likely to have at least one record to your credit if you have a profile of that kind. And the other element, quite disturbing, is gender. Male musicians are significantly to be more involved in record production than female. We don't have element to say whether it is a matter of life course, whether it is a matter of glass ceiling effect or whatever. We don't have any speculation. This is, however, a constant robust factor. Female are much more likely to assume that the child disproportionately only teaching only roles within these schools. This happens that these results are robust, as you can see, from model one is based on only involves gender and the first hypothesis, and gradually we introduce the other elements that we have considered. Being a semi-peripheral position doesn't have any effect, but all the network measures do not have any effect. Why do I keep the hypothesis 2 at the bottom? Because the EI index is linear, it poses no problem, but when introduce the EI square index, the number of cases falls down, because if you don't have any, there are actually a number of about slightly less than 100 people who claim no collaborators. So if you have no collaborators, the denominator is zero, and therefore you can bring unless you artificially attribute one collaborator to everybody, but it doesn't alter the results. So in this case, this explains why you see at the bottom, the N goes down from 253 in the first three models to 156 in the other. These models are also non-significant in general, and the overall probability of the model, and of course the pseudo R-square falls even more. For the first three models, the overall model is significant and suggests an effect, non-negligible effect, let's say, of collaborators. Now, what happens in the other case? The other case is much more interesting. First of all, the impact, I will take out the model 5 because it didn't have any impact on the results. What we have here is these are only the people who have some productivity. So with the bottom line, the N in the beginning is 126. These are the guys who are productive, who have some productivity. Across all the models, we find the same pattern that we found before. So the overall volume matters, maybe not particularly exciting. Gender matters, but interestingly, other dynamics come into play. The first dynamic, which turns out to be positive, the first mechanism is that organizations with a high organization, which in the average have a high number of external ties and a high number of relatively high density, okay, have also members who are individually more productive, or better, to put it more precisely, individuals who operate in organizations with that particular profile are significantly more productive than individuals who are not. What is not confirmed is the other hypothesis, namely that individuals that operate in contexts which are very poor in the average in terms of external and internal ties, they do not perform differently from musicians in the schools which are in the intermediate position. So if you think in terms of Burke's hypothesis about the impact of organization, what seems to have an effect is to be located is a positive effect to be located in organizations in which, in the average, musicians have collaboration both outside and among themselves. Being operating in schools which are largely disconnected, or which are only connecting on one level, either outside or inside, has the same effect. The other, and finally, what we find when we bring in the EI index, we could have brought it even in the previous model, but it does not affect. So I jumped that step, and I came straight to the model 4, which includes the AI index square, which presupposes a curvy linear relationship. The numbers go down, unsurprisingly, because there are even among these musicians that produce, there are people who have no collaboration. They probably they sing, the ones closest to the model of the individual creator and individual artist operating in his or her own term. But what is interesting here is that there is a negative relation between the square and the index, the square index, AI index, and the productivity. What does it mean? When is what does it mean that there is a negative relation? Remember the way it was defined. The index, the original AI index ranges between -1, which means that you are totally heterophilous, and 1, which is totally homophilous. The square value of both cases is obviously 1, whereas the index is 0 when you have a perfectly balanced relation. So this means basically that actors, musicians who have a sort of a more balanced network, or consisting partially of local colleagues in the local system and partially of people who are not part of the local system, they are significantly more productive than the rest. So to sum it up, the set of findings, I think personally, I think the fact that I like particularly this final result, and also the result regarding the hypothesis inspired by Bird, because it suggests that yes, there is non-trivial effect which goes beyond the simple assumption that volume of ties corresponds to a greater involvement, in this case in music, but also in other fields. And so, this suggests that both organizational and particular properties of the ego network of each musician work. Now, how do we translate this into for social movements? I would say there is certainly the first question is, how do we translate productivity? Do we translate the idea of activism per se, levels of radicalism? Probably yes, probably not. We need to. I think we need. There are several different measures, and on which having already spoken quite a lot. I'm eager to hear to Serafim's suggestion and wisdom on this level, and thanks very much for your attention.
You say the final word.
I know you can stop the sharing to begin with. Go back.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you, Matthew. Have you just turned off your microphone? You have, right? Yeah. Well, thanks very much. As I expected, this was a very, very interesting paper. So we need time to digest some of the findings, and I think there are several sort of analogies. So that's where I really want to push, where you left off, basically. For instance, let me start off with a couple of contingent or sort of comments that occurred to me as I was hearing your presentation, and which are not part of the paper. You mentioned at the beginning, and you stressed that these people are teachers, rather than oriented to, you know, record production or sort of other forms of creativity. So would it be interesting to sort of draw the analogy between people who are, you know, social movement professionals or people who have dedicated their life in practice, as opposed to the behavior or the productivity of people who are on the sidelines, like they do it on and off? I mean, this is not part of the paper, but it struck me as an important dimension. You haven't researched that, but it was a question that, which of course, if you wanted to sort of open up, you'd have to take that question up. But that, in my mind, also links to what you mentioned at the end of your talk about how does one operationalize productivity in the movement, yeah, or creativity. Creativity is different from productivity, right? If one is creative, they may not be productive, but they two are linked. We don't want to sort of build a wall separating them. But anyway, is record production a measure of productivity? Why operationalize creativity as record production? Because you mentioned in passing that people may be involved in gigs or other forms of activism, which may not be involving record production, but maybe they are outwardly oriented and, you know, prepared to establish links and so on. You do not mention that. You don't measure it. And one third observation, you also mentioned in passing, and I'm mentioning that not as a criticism, but as things that, you know, ticked me as I was hearing you, a more structural factor rather than relational, the size of the school. Like, I didn't see that play a role in the hypothesis. Like, if you are a faculty in a school of 2,000, does it make a difference? Like, what in a movement perspective would mean that if you're part of an organization of 2,000, does that enhance your possibility of sort of speaking out to other people, as opposed to being, you know, a member of a movement organization of 3 or 4 or 10 people? I mean, the size rather than the shape of the relationship, the size of the structural configuration once sort of starts off. Anyway, I think that it's very important to stick to the conclusions of this project, which is quite a complicated project. I mean, going back to the analogical sort of thinking, on the whole, I'd like to ask, what do you think, having conducted this research, whether you think that we are really entitled to draw analogies, or is this a very thin ground? Especially since some hypotheses are not verified, blank, you say this doesn't carry any water. And the number of variables, in my view, are not as of yet accounted for theoretically, such as gender, for instance, right? Which has been found to play a very important role, because if we think that gender is a factor cutting across, then what is the theoretical formulation of that finding? On the other hand, I mean, this may reflect like insuperable limits of the research techniques. How does one go about researching these things? But I'm still interested in the theoretical significance of that. And besides, and to be slightly more specific, I'd like to ask squarely whether you can also draw an analogy between movement productivity or creativity and social movement productivity in a theoretical sense. I've already asked the question, but what is hidden here is that maybe a sort of weary question, a doubt maybe that there are different forms or different varieties of productivity. For example, you may be having artistic productivity or academic productivity or movement productivity. And one concept that popped up would be sort of envision fields of productivity, different sorts. Like I may be productive as a movement activist if I engage in relations, but I may be more productive as an academic or as an artist if I do not. And this would reflect different fields of productivity. And on top of it, again, going back to the question of how do we operationalize productivity. And one suggestion, since you yourself raised the question, I might add movement renewal, like not doing the same thing over and over after you've seen that it's not really effective, that you need something different. But what that may be, of course, and again, one should also think about outcomes. Definitely, I think you mentioned that as well, like repertoire renewal and outcomes, like effective outcomes, which can be defined both in the short term and in the medium term and the long term. Now, having said that, let me stress again that I found the hypothesis very telling indeed, both because they implement a network understanding and because they point to the exploration of either two unexplored areas, of course. H1, about the importance of collaborative ties, which is a pretty straightforward, right? I mean, it's pretty straightforward hypothesis. But I was fascinated by hypothesis number 3 about this balanced combination of local, internal, and external ties. I'm not in a position to judge the research techniques, of course, the numbers and the diagrams. Of course, this is not a criticism, but I still do understand this notion of balanced. But I wanted to ask more theoretically, more qualitatively, is it just a balanced degree, something in between, or is there something more substantive we could describe at the outset? Like this guy is balanced, not this guy who has some of this and some of that, but possesses these qualities. Would that be? Because I find this notion of a balanced, between inverted commas, to be a very important, like, who would be a balanced activist? Simply an activist who talks both to the people inside the organization and outside the organization, or does he possess, he or she possess specific qualities? On the other hand, I do, of course, understand the meaning, balanced, and everybody else, I think, understands what balance is. But I think because of that, it is important to stress this argument. I think that the importance for productivity or for creativeness or for thinking outside the box or thinking and so on, all these good things, that is involved in coupling embeddedness in specific settings, on the one hand, embeddedness, and relations that give access to new ideas and stimuli from other milieus. I think it is also important to stress theoretically, this is a very important finding, the obverse. The less than expected productivity or creativeness, both of actors, musicians, whatever, who both hold many but highly dispersed connections in, risk isolation from a very specific context, the local context, and of actors who, though integrated in, their community, have little contact with the outside world. And of course, they tend to be, as the hypothesis puts it, self-referential. And I think this, lends credence to your network's perspective about the prerequisites of robust movement emergence. And I think it is important to spell it out In point of fact, I thought that was the pinnacle of the paper. Like, if there's just one major conclusion to be highlighted, is this notion of a balanced relationship. And you do that in the paper, although you didn't mention it about the rooted cosmopolitans by Taro.
Yeah.
Both rootedness and an outward perspective. And I think we can definitely build upon this. I mean, use this hypothesis for movement activities, and sort of, after, of course, we've operationalized what we're looking for: repertoire renewal, positive outcomes, resilience, whatever that variable may be, which sort of captures what we're looking for. So in this same context, though, I was a bit puzzled by the failure of hypothesis 4. Because I thought hypothesis 4 is the thing that ticked me. No, it's about the actors who occupied an intermediate position between core and periphery in their environment. At first sight, I thought that was sort of illustrating the mechanism through which the process involved in H3 operates. Like, who are the people capturing the best position to practice this balanced outlook? People who are between the core and the periphery, but this hypothesis wasn't verified. So I want to ask, what do you make of this failure theoretically? And one last comment, because I don't want to speak more, and I'm sure that several more things could be said if one looked more intensively at the data. For example, maybe sort of to question, sort of explore all the possibilities the paper gives us. Maybe we should drop for a minute the relational network perspective and think in terms of structures, such as the one that I just said about the size of the site generating the network node. One last question, though, has to do with the theoretical body you cited at the beginning. I don't know this literature, first of all, I must admit that, but I thought it was quite disparate. I'm not sure, like, about the, shall I use the term, the theoretical quality, because sometimes I thought that they both say one thing and another thing, the opposite thing. But maybe I missed something. The thing that I sorely missed, though, and I want to finish with that, is any attention paid to the content of the original media. You know that I like political content, right? So it should come as no surprise that I'm giving that comment. And to explain that, like, if I argue stupidities, or if I'm a very poor musician, okay, whatever, would I gain in terms of productivity if I managed to build external links, or I would just harm the links and the network to which I sort of key myself in? I mean, does the content, the quality of the node in the whatever network, whatever, musical, political, or otherwise, play a role? Something we can sort of try to sort of answer theoretically. Well, these are the questions. I have the comments. Again, I thought it was a very interesting paper, even though I've asked questions which lie beyond the paper, obviously, but these were questions which were generated by reading the paper. At first, you don't think that I'm going to see the analogies, but the analogies pop up. I mean, they are there to be seen. And this is what I said at the beginning about Mario's work on providing positive heuristics all the time. So once again, thanks very much. And now I open the floor to you, dear audience. Anybody who wants to ask a question, raise hands. No questions?
Can we maybe give a question later on after Mario responds?
Absolutely,
to yours?
absolutely.
Okay.
Yanni, you want to ask a question? You have to come here. Yeah. This is the hybrid form we have.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for everything that we listened today. A friend of mine in the borders of Austria and Italy reads a book right now of you, so I was having a little conversation with him. I would like to add a little bit things like denominators. Quantitatively speaking, what our professor Serafim said is that in order to define productivity, we have to have a denominator. It is the time, it is the sources or whatever. So productivity is always a ratio that has to do with the process and with our social, psychological culture or organization behavioral culture. So we need a denominator. Another one denominator we need when we have to see how the things went better or worse. So what change did it happen? We need the classical derivative denominator, status 1 minus status 0, divided by status 0. So I think that also this is a denominator. And then the third denominator we need also that you mentioned, Mr. Seferiadis, you mentioned at the end some other thing about changing and what else also about the measure.
For renewal or what effectiveness?
Effectiveness. Okay. Let's. I will find out. I think that we had to have a third thing there. Also, I would like to add and ask you. It was possible to define the direction of RO in the relationships, the causality RO in the relationship that you said about all these producers and schools, etc. And also a third one, also a little bit quantitative, is that as we saw to the networks, when we want to go from the deductively theorizing to productively theorizing, let's say having a model and go to make some quote unquote illustration of this. This network that you combine deductively, when you go and build it, quote unquote, in order, it will be heuristic. Heuristic. It will be heuristic. So in order to understand always in mathematics when to go to a heuristic complex of nodes, we always have to combine what you said about the diagram with the 4 squares. This type of diagram has to do with your variables, like a set of I say it in Greek, να κάνει τις ομάδες προσωμείωση, τις πραγματικές ομάδες. The teams of some teams of groups, yes, some experimental groups that if possible, control groups, if possible, to have an analogy, understand, with these four that you had in your diagram. I think that for the third one, you didn't understand exactly what I want to say, but I think that for the denominators, I was more precise. Thank you very much.
I spoke about size. I mean,
size, yes, size. Size needs a denominator also. It needs an absolute size in order to. Thank you very much. Thank you.
It's already a lot.
Couple of questions more.
If there are.
Yeah, if there are any more questions. Lucia wants to ask a question? Sure.
Okay, so thank you, Mario, for this inspiring lecture. But I think that I need to listen to this lecture once again and many times in order to make make an idea about how it works, at least. So my question was that why productivity matters in the field of collective action, as well as in the field of cultural interaction, let's say. And what is hidden behind the concept or the interest of productivity? Means that perhaps more productive individuals or collectivities are more have more strong inclination to create more interesting things, to produce innovation, perhaps because in the field of collective action, innovation is a very crucial parameter for the dynamics of action and collective action, and in the cultural spaces as well. So how is linked finally productivity with innovation? Or perhaps it's a very perhaps it's a very idiot questions, but sometimes we have to speak explicitly and to make these linkages in a very explicit way. So that was my question. First of all, why productivity matters, and the second one was about the conception of musical, if you want, spaces, or no, the interpretation of musical spaces. Can we say that all musical categories influence in the same way the candidate audiences, or are producing the same type of ties? For example, those who are involved in more classical repertoires influence in the same way their parallel core or semi-peripheral environments, comparing to those who are involved or embedded into rock music, rap music universes? Or my question is if or in different musical categories play a role in the construction and the formation of particular ties. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Do we have another question? Maria, if you want to ask your question, now is the time to do it.
Okay, thank you very much, Mario.
Okay.
It was refreshing to hear about music through networks and the way you've studied it. Music, well, here from Crete, I think from my very limited knowledge, is a very good topic to work on with the networks approach, because it seems to me that not only record production, but what Maki says, some creativity production, I think depends on external and internal networks, as your hypothesis points to. I mean, it was quite a refreshing paper that you presented. Applying, well, I'm trying to think of my frame of reference on music, and I thought that was really a very well, a very novel way to show us these ties, even though that you have a very local context and a small and I think that this would open up a new area. But I was not aware that other people like Crossley and Becker also have studied music worlds through this perspective. But I found your approach, opening a path. Not only for music, but I think for many areas of creative work, these types of findings would bring us closer to understanding the importance of networks in different areas. So I cannot give comments on the specific technical parts of what you presented, but I am very very happy to have listened to this. And also, it is a pity that you only had a limited number of variables. And as you said in the beginning, you didn't have the other socioeconomic types of data to see, even deeper into this. So thank you very much, Mario.
Thank you, Maria. Somebody else? If not, which is a big if not, then we should give to Mario the floor to comment upon the commentary. Right.
Well, thanks very much. I mean, this is a second. We need a second lecture. I apologize. I won't pick all the things I will pick because I will have forgotten by the time that, and I will pick a few. Starting with the issue, if I understood the issue of some of the general issue of context and related variables, it's clear there are some clear omissions that I'm perfectly happy to acknowledge, and I'm also perfectly relaxed about, in the sense that this is an exploratory study and it doesn't suggest a way of looking at a particular issue, a way which hopefully is not banal, is not trivial, and it's clear that if this prompts more sophisticated analysis based on more solid database, I'm extremely happy. So it's a cliche, but in this particular case, I would be absolutely delighted to be proved wrong by this. This is what we happen to have available, and we try to see if we come out with something interesting. Regarding the dimension, the other factor that we should definitely take into account, of course, there is an element linked to age of the people. Clearly, if you are older, you are more. It's not impossible. We try to figure out. We try to figure out the date at which these guys did the first recording, but there was an element. It didn't bringing this element into the analysis didn't really change the result. But the biggest problem was we don't have strong data on the age of these people. So it's very, very, very difficult to keep this variable under control. The only thing which the only thing which makes me less nervous about this is that what we are really paradoxically would be more problematic if we were comparing putting into the analysis variables that can substantially change by depending on age. For example, income usually it works is correlated with age, seniority, professional solidity in general, etc. Here we are looking at basically most of these are apart from gender, which usually is stable. Is I mean, it's a highly debatable topic, but generally speaking, is for many people, let's say it's stable. And on the other hand, all the others are relational variables. So if there is a bias linked to age, so we might assume that it might be at least partially linked to it. Of course, all the people might also be likely to develop a more extended set of ties. But this is something which cannot really eliminate. Regarding your question of size, I mean, these are all fairly small units. So, I mean, of course, I mean, if you are operating in an institution which is very big, there will be an internal division of labor, there will be fragmentation in units, etc. These are, for all the variation, they tend to range between 15 and 25. There is one school which is smaller than that, but in any case, that is relatively stable. The issue which is why I'm jumping here and why is the hypothesis for not working? Well, that's all the different. I'm pretty happy about the operationalization of the different hypotheses. There might be some gray area, so to speak, in refer to that, because what we have in the local context, if we focus exclusively, let's put it this way, in order to reconstruct the pattern of connections, we had to take two different steps. One, of course, we started from the extent to which the different musicians recognized each other as collaborators. So there was the strongest tie. But then, of course, that doesn't include the whole set of ties and connections and flows that go around. So we also brought into the bigger dense network that I showed. Also consists of weaker ties that are not claimed by the people, but are simply inferred by the fact that two people were operating with the same summer school rather than performed with the same band, etc. So this is a thinner connection, a connection that can facilitate the spread of ideas, but are not as strong as the other ones. And on top of that, we also added interpersonal links. So the question is, in that regard, one could question whether the school system, the 12 schools are the proper unit of analysis to define the territory and the local system. Because yes, they are because I'm saying that because there are also other schools which are outside the system, which are not publicly funded, which operate nonetheless, and which the musician can have a regular systematic exchange. In this analysis, they count as part of the external environment. So there might be elements linked to the operationalization of the tool, but on the other hand, that's as much as we could get with that particular hypothesis. Now, the most interesting thing, however, is regarding the issue of causality and causal direction, there is always a question, the classic question, chicken and egg regarding networks. Networks are created, are determinants of action, but action determines network. The question is, in this paper, we have stood by the by far the dominant tradition in the literature that suggests that when it comes especially to individual behavior, that networks predict behavior. Also, networks, as I said, are based on a much larger set of activities. They go in, they can be based on this collaborative network on a much larger set of activities than just record production. So, with the limits of the tool, I think I'm pretty satisfied that we are on relatively, let's say, on standard ground in this imposing positive and logical predominance. Maybe instead I would be perfectly happy with acknowledging the fact that the important thing is the co-presence of these different mechanisms together, rather than assume a very strong one-way causal relationship. But I still think that a causal relationship can work pretty well in this case. Other things. The biggest question is the one about translating the idea of productivity. First, productivity, of course, productivity and creativity are not exactly the same thing. I mean, one can be creative without being necessarily innovative. And in the field of music, is even more tricky. I think in the context, creativity is a sense, in particular, record production as opposed to other, is a sensible measure because also it's relevant for the school. I mean, if the schools teachers who produce records are all in all more attractive to committee students, it doesn't make a big difference when you're talking about 5 years old. When you're talking about, but the problem is here, there is then is not in that case. The problem is not getting pupils who are strictly speaking under the control of their parents, because that is pretty. There is a widespread positive view of musical education, not only in Trentino. So in Diaro there is more than a sufficient number of families, or more than willing for their kids to take some kind of musical education. So the problem becomes crucial, however, when it comes to attracting teenagers and or adults. There, having teachers, there have been other surveys from that in the project that suggest this. Having teachers who are visible, and they are visible in a format which is not the occasional concert in the square, but are visible also in terms of something which remains, which can be listened to and time, which can be shared, is an important factor. So for those organizations, and also from our point of view, thinking in terms of commitment, we thought is a good, apart from the fact that we have the data for that, and it was difficult to get comparable data on how many gigs a single person has played over the years, etc. Apart from practical reasons, it was also important, I think, it was good to have this type of data, because record production is a more complicated, it's a more demanding form of collective action, so to speak, than say just, it's like the difference between joining an organization, promoting or promoting a demonstration, and just turning up occasionally at a demonstration. It requires a different type. One thing is organizing. I'm not saying that organizing a gig is necessarily less. It isn't, but it is one level. Being recording is another level of complexity. It's a higher level of complexity, I would have to say. Exactly. And this brings us exactly the reference to this brings us to the other point. How do you measure? I mean, it's difficult. It's difficult to say. I mean, we can measure. Can be the performance, let's say, the performance should be facilitated. Is it, you can measure in terms of sheer commitment, in terms of radical commitment to a cause in the short term, or can we measure this in terms of, instead of more stable relationship, the career long, lifelong, so active career, of which Lager, McCartney spoke, Olivier Filleul spoke. What keeps people going in the long term? If people going in the long term is very unlikely that people stick to a single organization for the rest of their life. It's more likely that they gradually shift their involvements while continuing. So one possibility would be to start to see if, to what extent the fact that at each point in time, let's say, people who at one point in time are heavily committed to a single organization, are they more or less likely to keep going over time than people who operate with a more diverse, more diversified set? I mean, I'm speaking out of my, there are always a number of details linked to the operationalization of the mechanism of the process. But I think there will be one way to approach the issue. Another possible way, I would say, looking again at the role of the activists. Who are the activists that are capable of bridging different organizations, speaking to different organizations? Does this depend on the fact that they also can rely on a broader, in this case, we should reformulate, of course, even the relational matter. The relational property should be probably reformulated more in terms of embeddedness in different type of personal circle rather than thinking in terms of multiple organizations, because it's pretty obvious, it would be pretty obvious that a person who is active in many organizations is capable of bridging. So one should think about how to operationalize the level of interpersonal connection and how to operationalize the bridging role in terms of more official kind of recognized broker leadership brokerage role. But anyway, there will be another way we might think about it if it is worthwhile. So I think these are I would say, one is the persistence over time is one take, another one is the capacity to operate, to create a visible connection between, to speak to different words, to create different connection between movement organizations could be another one. Final point I wanted to address is, the differences between the genre. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what I'm saying. It's a small sample. If we break it down further, we risk really ending up with very few cases and difficult. What we could see is that if we look at the network of the main collaboration, what we find is that there are many small dyads or triads of people, and then there are two bigger components, which suggest a certain level of integration at the level of between these musicians in terms of collaboration among them. And one, one is composed of mostly jazz musicians. The other one is composed mostly of large majority of classical musicians. So the relational patterns seem to be pretty similar in the two groups. Some big components in the network, one each and then smaller ones. That's a good question as well. Very final issue, the issue of balance. I wouldn't go so too far personally. I mean, in extending the idea of balance from the system of relation with the person to more kind of balanced personality. I would say I would stay on a less lower, more modest ground. I was simply noticing that the amount, let's say, the fact of being exposed to different influence, local influence, which is based on day-to-day, face-to-face interaction, which is Poi emotionally creates an environment, a sense of collectivity, and at the same time being open to external influence. That I would keep that limited definition of balance to that particular level. I wouldn't go further than that. And I missed something. I apologize for those I forgot. I think more or less. That's good.
Well, thanks. The microphone. You did? Well, I think it was a very rich paper. Costa, you want a question? You want to intervene?
No, it's okay, but
Just,
I have to leave. I have to leave you because
okay,
the
no,
building
the
is
seminar here
closing
just
down.
okay.
So bye.
The seminar is closing down. Thank you very much, Mario. Thanks for this opportunity, and we'll keep thinking about the offshoots of some of the conclusions. Okay. Thank you to everybody. We'll stay in touch. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Okay.